The heavy mahogany tables at the Capitol Grill in Washington, D.C. are designed to absorb sound, but they do absolutely nothing to absorb condensation. I sat at the corner of a table for 8, watching a bead of condensation slowly trace its way down the side of my water glass. To my left, a $300 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon was being poured with practiced reverence by a waiter who knew better than to interrupt the man speaking. That man was Richard, a senior director at Apex Financial. He was currently holding court, entirely captivated by his own voice while my family hung on his every word. "It really is all about trajectory," Richard said, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "In the corporate sector, you're either accelerating or you're obsolete. There is no middle ground." "Exactly," my mother Evelyn chimed in. She leaned forward, her jewelry catching the low, amber light of the dining room. "That's exactly what I've always told Marcus. You have to position yourself for the summit from day one." Marcus, my 28-year-old brother, offered a perfectly rehearsed, humble nod. Tonight was his night. We were gathered here to celebrate his ascension to junior vice president at Apex, a role that came with a corner office, a $120,000 base salary, and apparently a license for our parents to pretend he was the only child at the table who had amounted to anything. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. There are moments when your training takes over before your emotions can catch up. Years of service had rewired something fundamental in me. Even in unfamiliar places, my body still defaulted to readiness. Stillness first, awareness second, movement last. A civilian uses words to fill the space. A trained operative uses silence to own it. "It's just such a shame about Sarah, though," my mother continued, her tone shifting smoothly from pride to a weaponized theatrical pity. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at Richard. The table went perfectly still. The clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain plates abruptly stopped. "She's just
wasting her 20s,
my mother sighed, finally casting a tragic glance in my direction. "Stuck doing GS4 government data entry, filing paperwork, punching numbers into a database." We tried to tell her that the military wasn't a place for a smart girl to build a real career, but she insisted. Now she just organizes folders for bureaucrats. My father, Arthur, offered a low, sympathetic chuckle. "I told Marcus earlier," he said, directing his attention to Richard, "maybe once he settles into the VP role, he can pull some strings, find her a spot answering phones at the firm. Get her out of that dead-end desk job before she hits 30. I felt the eyes of 5 corporate executives slide toward me. Their expressions were a synchronized display of uncomfortable pity. I was the cautionary tale sitting at the end of the table. The failed sibling, the unremarkable government drone dragging down the family's immaculate, high-earning pedigree. True discipline isn't about suppressing your anger. It's about rendering it operationally irrelevant. I kept my breathing shallow and even. I didn't flush. I didn't break eye contact with the condensation on my glass. Internally, my pulse remained at a steady resting rate of 60 beats per minute. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the cold, textured glass of my ice water. In my peripheral vision, I was tracking more than just my brother's smug, sympathetic smile. I had spent the last 45 minutes passively observing the adjacent booth. 3 men were seated there. 2 were military liaisons in civilian suits, their posture giving away their background the moment they sat down. The third was Thomas Vance. As the CEO of Aegis Defense Solutions, Vance oversaw a $3 billion empire of defense contracting. He was a man who briefed Senate subcommittees before breakfast. And for the last 10 minutes, I had watched him discreetly listening to our table. I saw the exact moment his posture shifted. I saw the moment he recognized my profile in the dim lighting. Richard, oblivious to everything outside his immediate radius of influence, let out a soft, patronizing laugh. "Well," Richard said, looking at me with the kind of smile you give a lost child, "data entry is honest work, Sarah. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure of the private sector. The stakes we deal with, they can break you if you aren't built for it." I lifted the water glass. The ice shifted with a soft, hollow clink. Before the rim of the glass could touch my lips, a shadow fell over our table. Thomas Vance had stepped out from his booth. He didn't casually stroll over. He moved with the deliberate, heavy presence of a man who owned the airspace. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than my brother's signing bonus, and he completely ignored Richard, my mother, and the newly minted junior VP. He stopped directly beside my chair. My brother's boss was halfway through a pitying laugh when the CEO of a $3 billion defense firm interrupted our table. Not to greet the new executive, but to snap to a rigid, flawless position of attention and salute the woman they all thought was a glorified secretary. Before Thomas Vance spoke a single word, before the oxygen left the room and my family's carefully constructed hierarchy collapsed, you need to understand the architecture of their ignorance. I am Captain Sarah Hayes, United States Air Force. I am currently assigned to the 361st Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Group. But to the people sitting around that mahogany table at the Capitol Grill, I was just Sarah, the quiet disappointment, the inevitable warning label on a middle-class upbringing. In my family, success was measured strictly by what could be displayed on a mantle or slipped into casual conversation at a country club. It was a highly tangible, highly visible metric. Degrees from Ivy League institutions, luxury car leases, and square footage in desirable zip codes were the only currency my parents recognized. Prestige is a heavy armor worn by people who are terrified of being ordinary. Marcus wore that armor exceptionally well. My brother was the golden boy, 28 years old, and newly minted with a $150,000 MBA from Wharton. He had followed the blueprint my parents designed for him with exact, unquestioning precision. Now, as a junior VP at Apex Financial, his life was a series of highly visible victories. Six-figure bonuses, title promotions, client dinners where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My trajectory was fundamentally incompatible with their metric of success. My victories could never be framed, photographed, or hung in a home office. They were buried under layers of federal classification, locked behind 4-inch steel vault doors and windowless safes, sensitive compartmented information facilities. You cannot brag about a triumph that officially never happened, and you cannot seek comfort for a failure that the government denies exists. When I commissioned as an intelligence officer, I didn't give my parents a plaque to display. Instead, I gave them a series of vague excuses and sudden absences. I missed 3 consecutive Thanksgivings. I missed my cousin's wedding. I disappeared for weeks at a time, entirely unreachable by phone or email, restricted by the rigid protocols of a top-secret SCI clearance. When you hold a top-secret clearance with sensitive compartmented information access, your life is heavily bisected. There is the person you are inside the vault and the ghost you play on the outside. To legally explain my absences under Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 798, the Espionage Act, I had to minimize my role. When my mother asked what I actually did at Langley Air Force Base, I told her I processed data and organized operational files for the Department of Defense. It was a technically true statement, mathematically stripped of all lethal context. They heard data entry. They immediately imagined me sitting at a beige desk, answering phones, and filing travel vouchers as a GS-4 civilian equivalent. They built an entire narrative around my perceived mediocrity because it validated their massive financial and emotional investment in Marcus. It was vastly easier to pity me than to try and understand a world they had absolutely no access to. People will always fill the gaps in your silence with their own insecurities. I simply let them write the story they needed to hear. There were times when the isolation of the lie felt significantly heavier than the Kevlar I wore overseas. When you spend 72 straight hours tracking high-value targets via satellite feed, running on black coffee and adrenaline, the last thing you want to do is come home and listen to your brother complain about the crushing pressure of a Q3 earnings report. I remembered sitting in my modest apartment in Alexandria, staring at a framed photograph of my unit taken just before our deployment to Bagram. The 3C61st ISR group doesn't deal in corporate margins. We deal in life, death, and the precise mathematical probability of both. I had lost colleagues. I had carried the immense, silent weight of knowing that a single miscalculated decimal point in my threat assessments could result in flag-draped transfer cases arriving at Dover Air Force Base. The greatest test of discipline is not how you handle an enemy's attack, but how you weather a loved one's underestimation. Yet when I attended family functions, I was treated like a fragile, unambitious child. My mother would introduce Marcus to her friends with a glowing resume, listing his financial portfolios, then gesture to me and say, "And Sarah is doing her government office work. The benefits are good at least." I accepted their pity. I absorbed their subtle, continuous jabs at my income, my uniform, and my supposed lack of drive. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain the complex geopolitical chess matches I was navigating daily. I had signed a non-disclosure agreement with the United States government, but more importantly, I had made peace with my own anonymity. I didn't need their validation to know my own operational value. I knew the exact caliber of my own strength. Tested and proven in environments Marcus couldn't survive for 10 minutes. I let them construct their elaborate hierarchy of corporate importance, completely unaware that their entire world existed safely under the umbrella of security provided by people like me. You learn in intelligence that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. I had spent 4 years tracking threats in absolute silence, so letting my family think I was a failure was just another exercise in operational security. The celebration of Marcus's promotion had entered its second hour, and the table for 8 had devolved into a masterclass in corporate sycophancy. Richard, Marcus's senior director, was holding court while tearing into a medium-rare prime rib. Evelyn and Arthur, my parents, were executing a flawless, synchronized campaign to flatter him. They wanted Richard to know that his brilliant decision to promote Marcus was a direct reflection of our impeccable family lineage. They wanted him to understand that Marcus's new $120,000 base salary was merely the opening bid for a lifetime of executive excellence. A family's pride is often a zero-sum game. To elevate one child, they must actively diminish the other. I sat perfectly still, a silent observer in my own family's theater. I watched my mother lean across the crisp white tablecloth. "You know, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into an artificially intimate register, "Marcus has always had that predatory instinct. Even in high school, he was organizing the other students. He understands the architecture of leadership." Richard chewed slowly, nodding his approval. "He's aggressive. Apex Financial needs aggression. We're moving massive capital. You need killers in those junior VP slots." I took a slow, calculated breath. The word killer sounded utterly absurd coming from a man whose soft, manicured hands had never held anything heavier than a Mont Blanc fountain pen. True danger never has to announce itself. It is an inherent physical property of the room. "It is a relief, my father," Arthur interjected. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, shooting a brief, disparaging glance in my direction. "At least we have one child who understands how the real world operates, one who isn't content to just drift." The conversation abruptly pivoted. The crosshairs settled squarely on my chest. "Drift?" Richard asked, his eyebrows raising as he looked at me. He had barely acknowledged my presence since the appetizers. "I thought you said Sarah was in the government sector." "She is," my mother sighed, her tone dripping with rehearsed exhaustion. "If you can call it that. She's wasting her 20s. She sits at a desk all day doing government data entry, processing files for the Department of Defense. Honestly, Richard, it's a dead-end job. It's a GS4 equivalent, my father added helpfully, demonstrating his total ignorance of both the military pay scale and my actual rank. She's essentially a secretary in uniform. We've told her the private sector is where the real money is, but she insists on staying in her little cubicle." The table fell silent. The surrounding executives stared at me with uniform expressions of polite disdain. I was the anomaly, the cautionary tale, the unremarkable stain on Marcus's immaculate evening. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to correct the record. A trained intelligence officer does not break cover to soothe a wounded ego. Internally, however, the contrast was staggering. As my father dismissed my little cubicle, my mind automatically accessed the sterile high-security environment of the SIF at Joint Base Langley Eustis. I saw the bank of encrypted monitors. I felt the ambient chill of the server racks. I thought of the operators I had briefed via secure satellite link just weeks prior, men carrying MK-17 rifles in the jagged hostile mountains of Kabul province, trusting my threat assessment matrices with their lives. The corporate world measures risk in quarterly losses. The military measures it in arterial bleed protocols. "It's not too late, Sarah," Richard said softly, adopting the tone of a benevolent mentor attempting to rescue a stray dog. "Data entry gives you a baseline for attention to detail. If you can type fast enough to keep up with government bureaucrats, Marcus might be able to fast-track you into a client services role at Apex, administrative support, answering the phones. It's better than rotting away in a basement." Marcus beamed, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "I could look into it," he offered generously. "Get your resume into the HR pipeline." They were offering me an administrative lifeline. They were offering to save me from the very career that was currently keeping the airspace above their corporate headquarters secure. My mother reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a small, heavy stock rectangle of paper and slid it across the mahogany table toward my water glass. "Take it," she insisted. It's a business card for an executive resume writing service. They helped Marcus. They can help you translate your filing skills into something an actual company might want to hire. I looked down at the card. I looked at my mother's expectant, disappointed face. My mother handed me a business card for a resume writing service across the table, entirely unaware that 48 hours earlier, my signature had authorized a drone strike halfway across the world. If you've ever had to sit in silence while people who know nothing about your sacrifices judge your life, hit the like button. Now, let me tell you how my training kicked in. I left the card exactly where it lay on the white linen. I did not touch it. I did not push it back. In a civilian argument, silence is often interpreted as submission. In an interrogation or a tactical standoff, silence is the ultimate assertion of control. At Maxwell Air Force Base, during officer training school, the instructors do not just break down your physical endurance. They systematically dismantle your ego. Ego gets operators killed. Ego makes you predictable. I had been trained to absorb verbal hostility without altering my baseline heart rate. Marcus leaned back in his chair, swirling the dregs of his $300 Cabernet. It's just about understanding corporate leadership pipelines, Sarah, he said, adopting the tone of a seasoned veteran addressing a raw recruit. When you're handling accounts worth $50 million, the pressure is immense. One mistake, one misread of the market, and the whole division suffers. You have to be built for real pressure. Government paperwork just doesn't prepare you for that kind of stress. A civilian defines pressure by the threat of losing capital. An intelligence officer defines it by the threat of losing blood. I looked at my brother. I thought of the $50 million accounts he was so terrified of mismanaging. I thought of my laptop securely vaulted under Title 50 protocols, containing satellite imagery of hostile encampments where a single miscalculation on my part meant 12 Americans wouldn't come home. I simply nodded. "She'll learn," my father said, turning back to Richard with an apologetic grimace. "We're hoping your influence might rub off on her tonight, Richard. Show her what ambition actually looks like." "Well, typing fast is a start," Richard chuckled, entirely pleased with his own wit. "Keep up with those bureaucrats, Sarah. Maybe we can get you a typing test at Apex." The urge to speak flared hot in my chest. It would have been extraordinarily easy to reach into my purse, pull out my military ID, drop it onto the table, and explain exactly what a captain in the 361st Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Group does. It would have been easy to explain that my data entry involved synthesizing signals intelligence to neutralize high-value targets. Discipline is the space between a highly justified reaction and a strategically superior silence. I chose the superior silence. My eyes drifted away from my family's self-congratulatory circle and began a passive sweep of the dining room. It's a habit you never truly turn off, assessing exits, identifying anomalies, logging faces. That was when my gaze locked onto the adjacent booth. I had noticed the three men earlier, but with the dinner's escalating hostility, I hadn't processed their identities. The two men on the outside were definitely military. Their haircuts and the precise economical way they handled their glassware gave them away. But it was the man in the center, the man in the bespoke charcoal suit, who made my pulse momentarily stutter. Thomas Vance. I had never met him in a civilian setting. The last time I saw the CEO of Aegis Defense Solutions, we were inside a fortified briefing room at Bagram Airfield, surrounded by reinforced concrete and HESCO barriers. He had flown in to oversee a highly classified extraction plan for his civilian engineering team, who had been pinned down in Kabul province. I was the intelligence officer who delivered the threat assessment matrix that guided his men out of the kill zone. He hadn't been wearing a $3,000 suit then. He had been wearing a Kevlar vest and the grim expression of a man terrified he was about to write 12 condolence letters to grieving widows. I watched him now as he finished his espresso. He was speaking quietly with the military liaisons, but I could see the tension in his jaw. The acoustics of the steakhouse meant our table's conversation had been drifting over to his booth for the last 20 minutes. He had heard my mother's sighs. He had heard my father's apologies. He had heard Richard and Marcus lecturing me about the immense pressure of corporate finance. A civilian sees a dinner table as a place for conversation. An intelligence officer sees it as an assessment zone. I didn't need to defend myself because the truth was sitting precisely 10 feet away, finishing his espresso. If you've made it this far, I'd ask one simple thing: subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means more than you know. Thank you, genuinely. You won't want to miss what happened when the CEO finally turned around. Thomas Vance stood up from his booth. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, murmured a final word to his military liaisons, and turned toward our table. My mother was still talking. She was halfway through a sentence about Marcus's unparalleled work ethic, but her voice faltered as the imposing figure of the defense billionaire stepped into her line of sight. Richard, recognizing Vance immediately from the covers of financial magazines, sat up straighter. A hungry, opportunistic gleam flashed in Richard's eyes. He assumed naturally that the CEO of Aegis Defense Solutions was coming over to acknowledge the rising stars of Apex Financial. Richard stood up, hastily wiping his mouth with his napkin, and extended his hand. Mr. Vance. Richard Sterling, Senior Director at Apex, and this is our newest. Vance did not look at Richard. He did not acknowledge the extended hand. He walked directly past the Senior Director, past my beaming brother, and past my bewildered parents. Power does not negotiate for space. It simply occupies it. Vance stopped next to my chair. The dining room around us seemed to instantly mute itself. He looked down at me, the hard, serious lines of his face breaking into an expression of profound, unfiltered respect. Captain Hayes, Vance said, his voice deep and carrying easily over the heavy mahogany table. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between me and the billionaire as if trying to decipher a foreign language. I stood up. I smoothly pushed my chair back, my posture shifting automatically into a rigid position of attention, before relaxing slightly into a professional stance. I met his eyes. Mr. Vance. It's good to see you under better circumstances, sir. Vance extended his hand. I took it. His grip was ironclad. I couldn't help but overhear the conversation at your table, Vance said, his gaze flicking briefly, dismissively toward my parents before settling back on me. I wanted to come over and personally thank you again, publicly. That isn't necessary, sir. I was just doing my job. Your job, Vance repeated, the word hanging heavy in the air. He turned his head slightly, addressing the dead silence of my family's table without actually looking at them. 3 weeks ago, in Kabul province, 12 of my civilian engineers were pinned down by a coordinated Taliban ambush. They were blind, outgunned, and waiting to die. Vance turned his full attention back to me, his voice tightening with emotion he rarely displayed to the press. Your threat assessment briefing, Captain. The satellite telemetry you decoded and the exfiltration coordinates you established under fire. You routed my men through a blind spot in the hostile perimeter. You guided an Aegis convoy out of a slaughterhouse. A sycophant's loyalty is only as deep as the nearest source of leverage. I watched the blood rapidly drain from Marcus's face. The $120,000 promotion he had been parading around all evening suddenly looked incredibly small. My mother stared at me, her hands trembling slightly where they rested beside her $300 bottle of wine. The business card for the resume writing service lay on the table between us, a glaring monument to her ignorance. Every single one of those 12 men came home to their families because of your operational clarity, Vance continued, his voice echoing in the quiet steakhouse. Aegis Defense Solutions owes you a debt we cannot easily repay. It is an honor to shake your hand again, Captain. The honor was mine, sir. Glad we got them out. Vance gave a sharp, definitive nod. He finally looked at Richard, who was still standing awkwardly with his hand half extended. Vance looked at him with the cold, sterile assessment of a man inspecting a damaged piece of equipment, then turned and walked out of the restaurant with his liaisons trailing behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a flashbang detonates. My family sat in a state of stunned, pale paralysis. All the condescension, all the weaponized pity, all the lectures about corporate trajectory had been incinerated in less than a minute. They had spent the entire evening treating me like a fragile administrative assistant, only to watch a titan of the defense industry treat me like a savior. Richard was the first to recover. The arrogant boss who had mockingly offered me a typing test just moments before executed a flawless, shameless pivot. He slowly sat back down, his eyes locked on me. The condescension was gone, replaced by a desperate, reverent curiosity. Captain, Richard said, the word tasting entirely foreign in his mouth. He completely ignored Marcus. When you build a risk matrix in a hostile environment like Kabul, how do you calculate the variable of human panic? I've been trying to streamline our crisis leadership models at Apex, and frankly, I'd value your insight. I looked at Richard. I looked at my parents, who were entirely incapable of making eye contact with me. I handled the shift in power with the chilling grace my training required. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply picked up my water glass. My brother had spent the entire evening trying to prove he was the most important person in the room, but it only took 30 seconds for a billionaire defense contractor to prove him entirely, devastatingly wrong. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. The ice shifted against the glass with a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the paralyzing silence of the table. I lowered the glass, letting my gaze sweep over the pale faces of my parents and the stunned, rapidly computing expression of my brother. I looked back at Richard. He was literally leaning forward, entirely ignoring his new junior VP, waiting for my answer with the desperate attention of a man who realizes he is suddenly out of his depth. You calculate human panic by understanding that corporate models assume logic under pressure, I told him evenly, my voice devoid of any vindictive edge. Military intelligence assumes chaos. You do not plan for how people should behave. You plan for how they will break. You build your matrix around the break. Richard gave a slow, reverent nod. He actually reached into his jacket, pulled out a silver pen, and jotted something down on his cocktail napkin. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in inverted dynamics. The hierarchy had not just shifted, it had been entirely demolished. Evelyn and Arthur attempted to pivot, stammering out sudden, hollow questions about my clearance level and my unit. Marcus ate his $300 steak in utter, suffocating silence. I didn't stay for dessert. I stood up, dropped a crisp $50 bill on the table to cover my water and the salad I barely touched, and walked out into the humid Washington, D.C. night. Validation from people who fundamentally misunderstand your character is a rapidly depreciating asset. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I didn't demand an apology on the sidewalk. When you have commanded a room simply by allowing the truth to surface, any additional words only cheapen the victory. I drove my modest sedan back to my apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, leaving them to navigate the awkward, devastating wreckage of their own condescension. Fast forward 48 hours. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The digital clock on my microwave read 0600 hours. The contrast between the oppressive mahogany walls of the Capitol Grill and the sunlit stillness of my kitchen was profound. I stood at the counter, pouring a black coffee from a French press. At my feet, a 4-year-old golden retriever named Mac let out a soft, contented sigh, resting his heavy chin against my bare toes. There were no executives to impress here. There was no armor required. The most profound victories do not sound like applause. They sound like absolute, uninterrupted peace. My smartphone sat face up on the granite island. The screen lit up, displaying a persistent stream of notifications. Over the past 2 days, I had received 24 text messages and 7 missed calls. Mom, Sarah, please call us. We had no idea you were a captain. Why didn't you explain what you actually do? Dad, Richard hasn't stopped talking about you. He completely ignored Marcus at the office on Friday. We need to do lunch and talk about this, Marcus. You could have given me a heads up. You embarrassed me in front of my senior director. I read the messages passively, tracking them the same way I tracked low-priority intercepts on a secure server. They were entirely predictable. My parents weren't apologizing for how they had treated me. They were panicking because their social currency had been spent on the wrong child. They weren't sorry they had insulted their daughter. They were sorry they had insulted a United States Air Force captain in front of a defense billionaire. An apology demanded by a change in your status is just self-preservation wearing a polite mask. I swiped the notifications away and locked the screen. I didn't reply. My operational security was no longer a mandate, but my peace of mind was. I took my coffee and walked over to my small oak desk near the window. Next to my encrypted laptop sat a heavy cream-colored folder bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. I opened it. Inside was a formal, handwritten letter of commendation from Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of the 361st ISR Group. He detailed the extraction in Kabul province, citing my exact use of Title 10 authority and the flawless execution of the threat assessment matrix. At the bottom in blue ink he had written, "Your quiet endurance saves lives, Captain. Keep your eyes sharp." I traced the edge of the paper. I didn't need Thomas Vance or a steakhouse full of executives to validate my worth. I knew my value precisely. I knew the weight of the intelligence I carried, and I knew the caliber of the operators who trusted me to bring them home. But as the morning sun warmed the wood of my desk, I allowed myself a small, rare smile. The validation wasn't necessary, but I had to admit, the tactical execution of that dinner was flawless. Real power doesn't need to announce itself at a dinner table. It just sits quietly, waiting for the ice to melt. The content on this channel consists of fictional stories created for storytelling and entertainment. These narratives are not intended to represent real individuals, organizations, or events. All visual elements are for illustrative purposes only. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been dismissed by the people who should have believed in you most, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. There are more stories ahead. Subscribe and stay with us.